Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Hybrid Chats. It's our seventh. Once a month, John Reardon, chairman of Grow Remote, and myself, Irina Jambazova, head of marketing at Boundless, meet online, wherever in the world we are, to talk about all things remote, hybrid, flexible, in office, and everything else that has to do with where people do their work from. Today, I'm in Sofia. That's back home for me, visiting for a couple of days. John, where are you today?
Well, I'm actually back home as well. I am in Cork in Ireland. I'm here for a few days in between kind of travels, and I'm actually heading to France tomorrow for the Rugby World Cup for a couple of weeks to support the Irish rugby team. So hopefully next time we talk, Ireland will be progressing fairly significantly in the Rugby World Cup.
I sincerely hope so. I shall be keeping my fingers crossed for Ireland as I'm there.
There you go.
Um, okay, so we'll leave the rugbying to the Irish team, and you and I will stick to what we know best, which is remote work. And to kick things off, we'll start by surprise, surprise, an article by Nick Bloom, our favorite economist and researcher from Stanford University. And this month's contribution to our show by Nick is an article in The Economist, which I think is a particularly interesting one because The Economist lately has been a little bit siding on, oh, remote work is dead, work from home, that's it. And Nick is actually arguing that that's not the case. It may have plateaued right now, it's stabilized, but it's about to experience a much bigger growth. And Nick being Nick, he's not just saying this is an opinion, but he's looking at data. And the thing he uses in this case is the surge of new filings with the American Patent Office. And there's a surge in submissions that have telework, work from home, or remote work. So there's definitely a lot more companies that are interested into kind of tackling the space. I wonder, what do you think, John?
I think it's incredibly interesting that we're seeing sort of I refer to it as a battle of the headlines because you see a lot of really good research that's out there where one or two elements of it might say are saying like, oh, there's a bit of a challenge here, a bit of a challenge there, but here are 10 data points that show that remote work is surging. And then what you see is the headline is on the, oh, there are problems afoot with remote work, while the underlying data is kind of a 10 to 1 on the positive. So we've got to be very careful about the what I call headline construction. For one, a sub editor can actually change the course of the narrative by with a headline. So I think it's important in this particular thing that in the Economist that Nick and his article got referred to as the Nike swoosh of remote work, where he's very clearly and very demonstratively and using a really good narrative of the Nike swoosh talking about an uptick that's going to happen. But I think it's also interesting to note that this is also being framed as a new phenomenon. But Nick Bloom and the rest of the folks in WFH research, they've been writing about this since the start of the pandemic. In fact, even since before that. But since the start of the pandemic, they've focused on US Patent Office data. Now, the lockdown, we all know, it caused a lot of introspection and it drove innovation as people suddenly had time to think, reflect, and assess where they were. And there wasn't a lot going on. And that's when people get quite introspective. So, not surprisingly, the US Patent Office saw a surge of innovative patents. And as you mentioned, those patents talked about are they searched the patents on the basis of remote work, work from home. They didn't actually, funnily enough, use the word hybrid work because it really wasn't in the lexicon back in 2020. It's more of a more recent word. But that surge in patents has continued unabated since 2020. And I don't think we should be at all surprised. Major systemic change and major dislocation is always a driver of innovation, always. And as Nick points out in the article, I think the quote he had was that the surge in work from home has sown the technological seeds of its own future acceleration. And that really is the underpinning thing, is that the seed capital for the future growth has already been planted, and we're going to see it. So what's the lesson for us all in this? And what I would say is what companies and leaders need to do now is to make a choice on how they're going to orient their business or orient their leadership style. Option one, do I try to create or recreate what we had in 2019? Or do I aim my business and aim my people for what I expect in 2025 and beyond? To me, it's a very simple thing. Do I live in the past or do I attempt to live in the future? And we're all programmed to lean towards safety, which is the past, and to be a little bit fearful of the future. But guess what? Fortune favors the brave, and the more we see companies leaning in towards the future, I think the brighter the future is. I think we will regret, and companies will regret stepping back and trying to recreate something that really has actually evolved. So I would say, I'd say Nick's article is very well worth a read, and I think he's absolutely bang on.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And it made me very happy to see in The Economist, because it's a much more mainstream publication than, say, his own research, the articles he puts out on LinkedIn and stuff. Hopefully this is going to reach a much broader audience, and like the right audience, because I think a lot of the detractors of remote work are the more traditional executives, who I can imagine are the Economist readers. And there's another really interesting thing that I found in his article, which talks about productivity. You and I probably haven't spent an episode without speaking about productivity. We know the numbers, but there is an even more interesting thing that he brings up, is even if, and this is something that came up in his Stanford study with his colleagues a couple of months ago, that when you actually look at it, there is indeed a bit of drop in productivity when it comes to remote, and it usually has to do with lack of mentorship, not so speedy road blocking, uncovering, and what have you. But what's really interesting is that he takes this and gives a very economical explanation why, even that this being true, it's still better productivity. And because I don't want to butcher it, I'm just going to read it. But essentially, he says that even if fully remote work reduces individual productivity, it frees up billions of dollars of office and transportation capital for other sectors of the economy, ultimately boosting overall productivity. Productivity, he asserts, hinges on outputs relative to inputs, right? That makes sense. Although fully remote workers may produce less per hour, they consume significantly less capital, potentially leading to a net gain in aggregate productivity. What do you think, John? That makes sense, doesn't it?
Look, I'm tired of the implication that productivity is lower for remote workers. A lot of research has been done, and it is pretty balanced. There's some areas where productivity is lower, but some areas where it's higher. Even still, we've seen so many articles on this topic, and if you focus on the editorial leaning of the publications, you get to see a clear direction on the intent. Either remote or hybrid work is good for society, or we must support big business requests to get people back in the office. So here are the facts as I see them. Hybrid and remote work, as Nick has pointed out, is significantly cheaper for both the employee and the employer. Frees up a ton of capital. Okay. Less time commuting is better for us all. And by better for us all, I mean physically, mentally, and environmentally. Next point is that employees typically spend less money in this model, and have more time to devote to their families, their physical well-being, their mental well-being, and their hobbies. And this also drives a societal benefit. Any calculation that's done on productivity needs to also weigh in societal benefit, environmental benefit, and physical and mental well-being. And the great leadership, there are countries out there that are looking at essentially happiness indices in line with GDP as a real index of growth in their countries. And I think the more we actually look at both strictly economic indices as well as people-centric indices, I think we'll do a whole lot better, and we'll be making for a society that will be well worth living in over the course of the next 10 years. So I think there's an awful lot to be said about a balanced view on productivity and not leaving it up to some journalist or some sub-editor picking out one piece and blowing it out of proportion.
Absolutely agree with you. And I think that's why there's a reason why Nick comes up in every episode, because he's just has such a strong data-driven way of refuting, what journalists and sub-editors may deem worthy of headlines. And speaking of worthy of headlines, something else that has come up this month is a really interesting article by Gleb Tsipursky. I would say Gleb is probably going to be the next second favorite contributor that we'll keep on coming back to on the podcast. And his perspective is something that we haven't really had come up on the podcast, but we know exists, which is this notion that this criminal activities happening of remote workers having two jobs. I remember when it first came out last year, it's just that the headline shocked me on so many levels, in ways of, when did this become a criminal thing? Firstly. Secondly, if these people can do two jobs, fair play to them. Also, no one wants to have two jobs. If the first one paid enough, I don't think they would go for a second one. But leaving all of these things aside and focusing on what Gleb is talking about, he really brings up the fundamental issue of these headlines, of these news stories, is that they exploit our narrative fallacy. It's a cognitive bias that leads us to interpret the world in stories, not facts. And you and I would agree that that's constantly a thing with remote work. But this is a particularly problematic one because it really goes on this criminality, and there isn't really an evidence. And what he actually looks at is there evidence that more people are working two jobs? Like, you can't just make these claims, right? So before we get into like how he refutes it, I'm curious what you make of these stories and this criminality.
Okay. So, I think you've identified it. Gleb is going to be another opinion maker that I would encourage listeners to tune into, because he is he's a really bright voice in this whole world. And his article, in my opinion, pretty clearly debunks the myth that there's been a growth in people working two jobs. And he's focused on the Federal Reserve data in the US, which actually says the opposite. So the data, the most important underlying data, says that it's not true very clearly, that because less people are actually working two jobs than there were a few years ago. So, that's an indefatigable truth. We can't walk away from that. So what it says to me is it's incumbent upon us all to question the source. So when an article shines the light on one person's story about working two jobs, you can easily be made to feel like this is all pervasive and this is common across society. So what's clearly an experience of one, amplified by a professional writer, and then given a launching pad by a publication that's probably looking for eyeballs. It's no wonder that we see such clickbait that, oh, a surge of people working, potential surge of people working two jobs. The underlying data debunks that completely. So what I'd say here is question the source and don't be a sucker.
Yeah, simple as that. And it's interesting the way he tells the story is it starts from an executive that he is consulting, and the executive basically makes the claim, I'm sitting on all of these boards, and in this other board that I'm sitting on, there's this thing, remote workers doing two jobs. So therefore, in my company, at least 10% of people are doing this. So then Gleb starts, kind of uncovering this and working with the executive to prove that this is complete fallacy. And the numbers are, as you mentioned, from the Federal Reserve of economic data, is apparently 0.3% of the entire working population in America have two full-time jobs. And the thing that Gleb also brings up, which is something that I really love, this notion that, oh, if people are in the office, they're doing work and surely they can't be having two jobs. The reality is we don't know. Even if someone is 5 days in the office, we don't know what they're doing on their computer. They may as well be having two jobs. So the fact that they work remotely, it's in no way indication of having or not having two jobs.
This is one of these ones, it's not going to go away. It's going to be very interesting because it's such clickbait. So again, I'd say just question the source and maintain a level of healthy skepticism.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And another reason why I found it a little bit ironic is another article we have this month is the 2023 Global Life Work Survey. And it was conducted by a couple of companies. And one of the things that they uncovered is there is a big difference in the number of people experiencing burnout. And turns out these one job holding people that work in offices are in fact a lot more burned out than the remote work people that are supposedly holding two jobs. It's 41% for the office workers and 26% for the remote workers. So, it kind of completely challenges this notion of office work is better for work-life balance, because you can switch contexts and stuff. Turns out we're better at establishing healthier boundaries when we are at home. What do you think, John?
Look, burnout in many cases is being presented now as an issue that's just cropped up since 2020. That's what you're being led to believe. My experience runs completely contrary to that. People have always had some challenges with work. There have always been people who have worked too hard, who have not had a balanced view on work. That's always been there. Where I do have a real cause for serious concern is with companies that have not intentionally and consciously set up their teams to be remote first. So, some companies flipped the switch in the middle of 2020 and said, okay, all of you now are going to work from home. That doesn't bestow upon a team all of the characteristics required or all the infrastructure required to be successful. So for people for whom it didn't work, who said they burnt out at home, what's being presented as, oh, remote work or the very fact of working from home has caused people to burn out. And what I would say is, let's be very aware as to how well a company set these people up for success. So if you did everything in your power to set a group of people up for success and you saw an uptick in burnout, then I think that's something that you should actually address and have a look at. If you just chucked people out the door, said, go off, go do some work, and then a couple of months later, a few people came back and said, oh, we're burning out, and you really truly recognize that you haven't put in the infrastructure, it's a very different story. And I think the two have been conflated here. And I would welcome, I welcome a lot of the discussion on it, but I would also always ask companies, have you done everything in your power to create an environment where everybody is given the opportunity to work from home, to be given the same opportunity to deliver from home as they are from work? If you've done that, then we'll talk about burnout in a more balanced way. Otherwise, it tends to be a biased conversation.
I agree with you completely. And I think there is, and it's come up in our conversations before, this notion of intentionality, like being very, very intentional. And I think that's an interesting point around burnout. And one way we know companies are trying to tackle this is by introducing the 4-day week. And it's something that's, again, gained traction over the last couple of years. There's been experiments done with it. And this month we have a really interesting article in The Atlantic that kind of talks about this very important topic of a 4-day week could be a hit and miss or a very successful thing. And it's kind of up to the companies that implement it to do it right and to not do it wrong. Because for that same thing, if someone is extremely overworked, all of a sudden telling them, oh yeah, you have to do this exact same amount of work, which is probably over 40 hours anyways, you have to put it into 32 hours and take that Friday off. But if they have all of this work that they have to do and they're not really taking the time to rest, again, it's going to be burnout. So it's all about the intention. But I do wonder, what are your thoughts on the 4-day week? Does it really, because it is complicated to make it work, what do you think are some of the benefits, some of the drawbacks, and your general thoughts on a 4-day week?
Let me cast my mind back to a couple of years ago. So I was strangely and almost darkly against the 4-day work week back in the past. And when I look back, I actually struggle to really understand why I was against it, why my thought process was so rigid. But please understand, I would have had 25 to 30 years at that stage of working with in a systemic, working in a system that was a 5-day work week. So I was institutionalized, and I felt that that's what you needed to do. So the whole concept of a 4-day work week imbued upon me, or basically foisted upon me, the feeling that 4 days is skiving off for a day and you're not putting in the effort. So that was my kind of innate feeling. What the last couple of years has taught me is a very different perspective. And so how I observe this debate and this discussion now is different. I now view work really as an output. And I think we should judge people on the output. I see time as an input and I think we need to trust our people to put in enough time to deliver the required output, because they're going to be judged on the output. And companies that focus on judging people on the input and ignoring the output are essentially moving back to what I would call almost a factory floor environment, where somebody is actually, this is a little bit of a silly point, but when somebody swipes into a factory, they're getting paid, whether they really work or not. And you can literally walk around and kind of hide away from work, or you could walk around and hide away from work and clock out at the end of the day, and you have actually done, quote unquote, according to the company, you have been there all the time, so you're going to get paid. We all know that's rubbish. It's a rubbish way to live your life. So what we've evolved as a society in the last 20 years, 20, 30 years, focusing far more in terms of output. And I think that's where we need to lean even further and focus on output. So when you focus on the output, whether it's 3 days or 4 days or 6 days, it's what is somebody producing? And if somebody is able to deliver in 4 days, great. And the research would show, and there's a really good, robust research, and there's a lot more to come. So let's watch it over the course of the next couple of years, that the 4-day work week is actually favored by a lot of people who've now seen a little bit more autonomy. They're actually delivering at least the same, if not more. So let's give this time to build up a large enough cohort of data so that we can get a sense as to whether or not the 4-day work week really is going to replace the 5-day work week. I actually think it will.
Yeah, no, I think you're bringing a really interesting point, and I think it's like the 4-day week is, it almost feels like it's the same as hybrid, where it's freedom, but putting a bit of boundaries to freedom because we don't know how to deal with too much freedom. So fully remote feels too much freedom. So let's do hybrid. Let's give you the chance to work a couple of days from home, but then come to the office. And the 4-day week also sounds like a chance of giving you flexibility, but not full flexibility, right? So I think it's probably a transition into where we're going to get to. And where we're going to get to, it's an interesting point. And this month we have a whole host of predictions from Chris Hurd, who is an amazing voice and opinion in the remote work space. And while we'll share all of them in the notes for this, I thought we'll share kind of our top three, and I'll actually cheat and say that I have an extra one, which is directly from what you just said, which is around, this sense of extreme freedom. Nobody watches hours. All focus is on contribution. So that's what Chris Hurd kind of predicts. But then going back to my official favorites, the first one, that, because it's third space, the first one that I really like is this notion of third space, and that the rise of workspaces close to home, or close to wherever work is happening, being ubiquitous. And I think, again, we have Wi-Fi everywhere. We have nice coffee shops. Dublin is an example of no lack of nice coffee shops. I've actually bought myself a little portable monitor that I usually bring with my laptop as well. So it's a bit of I feel a little bit like a turtle, but I basically bring my entire office and I can sit down in every coffee. So I definitely love that one. What's your first favorite?
On this whole concept of another space, I think remote retreats. I think Chris mentioned remote retreats being a kind of one of these predictions of the future, where purpose-built destinations will be used by distributed companies. Really, what we're talking about here is that companies that have dispersed their employees or allowed their employees to disperse will have a very intentional focus, whether it be once a quarter, once every 6 months, or once a year, to bring everybody together. So what we're going to see is some of these larger destination type retreats where and a lot of companies have done this. They have an annual summit, but I think that will become a real focus of organizations. Because if you think of it, a lot of companies were spending somewhere in the region of $15,000 a year, US dollars equivalent, to have each individual in an office. So suddenly, if you save that across a body of people, a couple of hundred people, you suddenly have a war chest, a significant amount of money to actually devote some of it to an annual summit. So you can fly people in and actually have a 2, 3, 4, 5-day summit in a particular in a really nice destination. And companies have done this for years, but it can now be more intentional. So the whole concept of a remote retreat will enable people to work from home and then have this 1 or 2 or 3 times a year where they all get together and have that element of collaboration, deeply intentional, purpose-driven. And that's a very important thing, not just, oh, let's all get together and sit in the hammock and do all that. No. This is very, very intentional. We're going to meet together 2 or 3 times a year. Here's the plan. Off you go.
Yeah, no,
remote retreats, big checkpoint.
Couldn't agree more with you. And we are an example of that as well. Boundless does that sort of remote offsites 3 times a year. We actually have our fall one coming up in about a month, and everyone's excited because it's a chance to meet, it's a chance to do some work, but it's a chance to also bond. And I think a lot of, if you remember back at the start of the pandemic, there was this assumption that, the fully remote companies from before COVID were going to be, totally fine. They would do perfectly well. And what these companies were saying is no, because we rely on in-person meetings as much as everyone else. Maybe not every day in the office, but 3-4 times a year. Like Automatic was a great example, where I think they would meet 3-4 times a year, and they really struggled when they couldn't do that. So completely agree with you. My next favorite, and it's kind of around the remote line of things, is remote living. In Chris's standpoint, that's the emergence of RV companies creating mobile workspaces. We certainly know, van life has become a thing. People build their own vans, or if they're lucky enough, they purchase ones made for them and stuff, and then they buy their little Wi-Fi thing, or they have mobile internet, and they just do their work, and they sit in the van, and then mornings and evenings are spent wherever they are. So I think that's a fantastic thing, and I look forward to all the different amazing vans and RVs that are going to come up in the years to come.
The one I'll add on to that was another prediction was about remote visas, and I think that we're going to see an arms race across nations as they compete to attract workers with incentives. It doesn't have to be huge incentives, but I mean, there are some countries that are doing very well. Portugal has done very well. Estonia has done very well, and there are a number of other countries out there that are pushing the narrative of making their particular region or their particular country attractive. What's required really is good internet connection, decent accommodation, nice food, reasonable climate, and every country has a couple of places, a couple of regions within the country that actually have all of those. And what's just required is the proper intent from either federal government or regional governments to actually put out the welcome mat for remote workers. So the more RVs that are out there traveling around, let's say Europe, the more likely that remote visas and the attraction of remote visas to attract workers. Because at the end of the day, an extra couple of bucks spent in a small town in a relatively rural community by somebody who's not from that part of the world, that really helps economies grow, and it helps also the level of diversity and inclusion. So I think society benefits from both your point about remote living and Chris's other point about remote visas.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more with you. And it is a great thing to see. I mean, you and I are spoiled. We're EU citizens. We can travel around Europe.
Yeah.
Without a problem, but people outside of EU, it's much harder. And then for us, the rest of the world apply for visas. Southeast Asia is definitely a very common destination for digital nomads and remote workers. Usually visas are a month, sometimes less. So seeing things like Vietnam recently enhanced its visa on arrival program from 1 month to 3 months. Well, this means that I can go and spend 2-3 months there working from there and not worry about this. It's not necessarily a remote work visa, but it feels that there's definitely this easing off of travel, which is fantastic. And then for me, the final thing of Chris Hurd's predictions that really resonated and kind of relates to what we've been talking on this episode around burnout is predictive burnout. So we know AI with ChatGPT and all that is becoming much more a mass product. But what he predicts is that AI is going to have a much bigger role in detecting signs of burnout and scheduling necessary time off. Because again, as we were saying, we're not always great at doing that. We're not always great at, kind of seeing the telltale signs of, I'm about to, I've been, burning the candle on both ends and stuff. And I certainly would love a bit of help from whether it's ChatGPT or any other of the AI tools to be like, hey, close your computer, take a few days off you go.
And you know why this is not unusual? You look at most mobile phones now have a kind of a focus setting where you can actually turn focus
Yes.
on and off. And so there, without a doubt, there are predictive elements that would actually be able to encourage you to do that. So this is the positive use of AI. I think Chris is bang on this one. The one I like, the last one I'm going to leave you with is he's predicting that we're going to become more green conscious, and that distributed workers and distributed work will be recognized as a green revolution. Like what I've seen here locally in Ireland and in other countries is that the more time people have spent at home, the more they're focused on their home energy consumption. And there's two aspects to that. I see companies and hear of companies asking their employees to share their home electricity and utility bills to get a sense as to whether or not a company as a whole is actually spending less on electricity, with the employees being distributed around the place and actually calculating the extra amount of electricity that they're using compared to with everybody being in an office building, because you have to kind of balance all of that. That's on one point. The second aspect of it is you'll see an uptick in the number of people who work from home who are looking at solar panels to look to be more energy conscious, because the longer you are at home and the more you are at home in the middle of the day and being able to actually use power that's being generated during the day, I mean, that's again one of these incredibly simple societal benefits. And there are countries and jurisdictions out there where the government, both federal and regional governments, are encouraging people through incentives to actually to put on more solar panels to actually generate their own electricity and to be essentially self-generating or off-grid. So green conscious, without a shadow of a doubt. I think we'll look back and talk about 2020, albeit a very unfortunate pandemic, with that being the watershed for people being more conscious of their energy use.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, let's just hope that all of these predictions, or even our favorites, come true, because certainly there's a lot of hope and there's so much potential for remote work to help in so many ways, both companies, people, their mental health, the environment, which we certainly do need to do something about. But on that note, we'll call it a day. We'll call it a month. Now, thank you so much, John, for, as usual, sharing so many of these articles with me in the first place, and kind of elaborating on your thoughts about them. It's always such a joy talking about these and really understanding the ins and outs of remote and why we see the things we see, why the headlines are as they are, and being able to see through them. I hope everyone's enjoyed this episode. If you come across any articles, feel free to share them with us. We'll be very happy to include them in our chats. You can do that on our Coda document. There is a link in the show notes. And inside the Coda document, there's a very easy way to add your article. But in the meantime, thank you, John. Enjoy France. I hope Ireland wins or progresses or whatever the rugby term is. And I will talk to you next month. Take care. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.